And here we are once again, Mark Tommerdahl and Bob Dennis, resident grumpy scientists. Couldn't get a victim today.
No,
so
couldn't get it. Nobody would take us up on the guess.
They ran.
They're all scared.
I haven't seen professors run that fast for a while. You'd think there was a prize at the end or something. So anyway, today we're going to answer an email from Ivan T. who asks us a series of questions. Mark.
I'll read it since I don't know the answer to the first couple. Can a show be made to talk about reprogrammed A9 for head injuries?
Questions that I can't figure out on my own. Okay, so can the A9 be reprogrammed? So he's referring to the model A9, which is the sort of the original flagship product from my company, Micro-Pulse. And the model A9 only has one protocol on it. And in order to do the head injury study that Mark and Dr. Pollack did, with a little bit of input from me, about a year and a half ago?
Yeah, it's been a couple of years.
2 years ago now, maybe, the traumatic brain injury and PEMF study. I had to reprogram the device because we only used a specific pulse pattern. Now, remember, we talked about this before, but, you know, we repeat things because they're important. We only picked one specific frequency of one pulse pattern because that's a scientific expedient, and that doesn't mean that it's clinically the best thing. So once again, you have to separate in your mind the notion of what someone did in a scientific experiment where they were trying to show statistical significance versus what a person would actually do clinically or in their home that is probably best for them. You see this all the time. Studies of diet, they do all kinds of things to exclude confounding variables, but that's not really practical for most people. So that's the long answer. The short answer is, you know, okay, yes, can a show be made on this? Here you go.
I guess this is the show.
This is the show to talk about that. Yeah, we can talk about that reprogrammed unit, but we really I would rather point you towards the Model M1, which includes the protocol that we used for that study, the protocols we plan to use for all future studies, and the actual practical protocols that people use when they're not in a study. So you can give us a call at Micro-Pulse. I'll put the number down there, put the email, and I'll answer you individually.
Does reprogrammed A9 have any other uses on other body parts?
The answer is that's what it's intended for. The A9 was developed specifically for severe chronic crippling orthopedic pain and chronic inflammation. The fact that it seems to be useful for concussion and TBI is sort of incidental. I would never have guessed that when I invented it. So it's really designed more for like back pain and orthopedic injuries. But once again, you're probably better off with an M1, which has more, 30 protocols, not just one.
Well, here's an interesting question. Does this impact brainwaves? Could I use the reprogrammed A9 alongside neurofeedback, e.g. biofeedback, or could it complicate or inhibit the neurofeedback or mild hyperbaric oxygen therapy?
What do you think?
Well, this is something that we've been talking about, setting up experiments to do and trying to understand.
We'd like to know.
So the overall question is, how does it work? How does PEMF work? And the answer to that is, I know the answer to this.
Anyone? Bueller.
I don't know.
That is correct.
That's the correct answer.
That is always the correct answer.
Nobody knows.
Okay, well,
But my guess. Okay, now we get into since we're in the entertainment business on this show,
because we don't get paid for anything else,
and we get to guess on everything, So my guess is that it's actually, I think it's modulating the glial modulation.
Okay, serious science now. Yes, I think that's correct.
And I think that what's going on is it's somehow modifying basically the overall pictures. It's modifying the brain to not be maladaptive. And what happens a lot of times is your different tissues don't heal themselves or don't go along the natural lines of plasticity, but I think the pulse electromagnetic field massages it out of that negative feedback loop that it can't break out of.
And I agree. And full disclosure, Mark and I had an hour or 2 hour discussion.
A long discussion, yeah.
Yesterday or Friday or something like that.
Well, yeah, I guess we were going to have a grumpy.
A couple days ago, we were going to have a grumpy hour. We ended up just sitting outside on my porch talking about exactly this topic. Like, what is it exactly that PEMF is doing in the brain? And it used to be that people thought that neuroglial cells were just, I was taught they were helper cells.
They were called glia, stood for glue.
Right. And then they called them glue
together.
cells because they didn't know what they did. So they're kind of in between there. Maybe they're glue. They're holding the neurons together.
Yeah.
I was taught in graduate school that they're helper cells and they help neurons stay healthy.
And it's gone completely to the other extreme in some groups. Not everyone says this, but a lot of people. They're the small faction people that say glia are the important stuff, and neurons are just there to help the glia, which is a little bit extreme.
A little bit extreme. So yes, the pendulum of science going from one really wrong opinion back across reasonable range to another really wrong extreme, sort of like politics, which we don't discuss here because we're not that grumpy and don't get us started. Okay, so don't ask any question about politics. But I'm going to tell you what. I'm going to defer that question to a full discussion, and I'm going to ask my esteemed colleague, Dr. Tommerdahl, to
wow, never called me esteemed before.
Yes, I do, but just not to your face. I just don't want it to feel weird, right? But maybe we can discuss that in depth because I think it's an extremely interesting topic and just pretty much a free-form discussion like Mark and I had earlier.
We might even have some pictures.
We might even have some pictures. We'll try to pull some stuff up because we've actually had the benefit of talking this one through pretty thoroughly. So anyway, does the unit impact brainwaves? Now, let me answer that question a different way. A lot of things seem to impact brainwaves. Noises, metronomes, flashes of light, different places, including in your eyes and, temples, electric shocks, and PEMF. These all seem to, if they're at the right sort of range of frequencies, they can all kind of like do something, I think it's called brainwave entrainment, where you kind of like bring someone into an alpha wave or a theta wave or a beta or a delta wave state. Now, if you're interested in that kind of stuff, as I am, the Micro-Pulse model M1 is designed specifically to allow that. Whereas the A9 has none of those. The model M1 has essentially all of the widely accepted brainwave ranges. So there's like a delta wave, and there's an alpha wave, and there's 3 different levels of beta, different frequency bands, and stuff like that. So if you're interested in that kind of stuff, the short answer would be I'd say it does impact brainwaves. Many clinicians who have used the model M1 to adjust people's brainwaves tell me it works really well, and they use EEG to confirm it. Yeah,
and by the way, all these things he mentioned, we actually have data with the brain gauge on from people that use these different methods on their patients, like hyperbaric oxygen therapy. There's actually a couple of websites that have our stuff on their website.
Yeah.
Where they,
our stuff being the brain gauge.
Yeah, the brain gauge. And, really the only way to know what you're doing is to measure it and see what the impact is.
That's the important point. We're working towards that one. We're angling towards that one.
I didn't even realize that. Okay.
so
here's another question. Coils have some negative reviews due to needing frequent replacements. Can this be prevented, and can the life of the coils be extended? Oh, I know the answer.
Anyone?
Okay, me.
Mark Tommerdahl.
Well, I sat through a previous question and answer on this, and people, what's replacement coils? $20-$30?
About $22.
Yeah.
They cost what they cost us. So.
But if you were to spend a few $1,000s each, they'd never have to be replaced.
I could make them out of grade 5 titanium, or I could make them out of waspaloy or something like we used to use for armor plating on space-based weapons, and I could charge $1 million for them. Or I could make them really heavy, and they could be like a fence post. Yeah. Or what I could do is I could actually do the sort of manufacturing analysis of where do I get the optimal point on the cost and the usability, the cost to the user, and the durability, and that's actually what I've designed and built. And so when people rip off our devices, we always know when a company's fixing to rip off our design, because the first thing they do is buy a couple hundred of our coils because they can't make them as well as we do, because when they make them they cost 3 times as much or 4 times as much as they have to buy the first few hundred from us. So we can always tell, and we figure out who they are. There's a few companies trying to rip us off, and they hang around for a few years, sometimes just a few months, until they realize they can't make them anymore. And the answer is that we don't make any money on those coils. We wish they would last forever, but they don't. But if you want to have something that is wearable, that is comfortable, that doesn't weigh too much, that lasts a pretty long time, depending on how well you take care of it, that's a pretty good design. It'd be hard to beat. I haven't seen anybody make better ones yet.
Next question is, what does 5 parts per million mean?
5 ppm.
No,
it does not mean 5 parts per million. It means 5 pulses per minute, and it should be pulses per second. Maybe I typed that as pulses.
I guess I got
per
the
minute.
answer wrong. Huh?
Yeah, it's ppm means parts per million, but usually on our web page and on our Micro-Pulse documentation, it should say PPS, and that's pulses per second. And the reason I talk about pulses per second, and I don't tend to use hertz, is that when I was a young boy, I came up through engineering and like signal processing and things like that kind of stuff, and we didn't describe square waves or trapezoidal waves in hertz, unless we were doing a frequency spectral analysis or an FFT or something like that. So the thing that makes most sense to people is pulses per second. That it's both technically correct and it actually is understandable. Hertz means something different, and that means cycles per second, and it's a little bit different. It's a single number when you're talking about like a sinusoid, but none of the effective EMF systems are sinusoids. They're all supposedly square or trapezoidal waves. So technically, I don't like to use hertz, but it's become more common when people talk about the frequency, the clock frequency in hertz, rather than just.
Well, if you use hertz, I would have gotten it right.
Yeah, well, that's why he's asking 5 ppm. It should be PPS. I'll go through my docs, make sure it's not too deeply wrong. E, do I need to use the brain gauge? Wouldn't the results, improvements be noticeable in everyday activities? Mark's favorite topic.
So I think actually we should give a short answer here, and then the next video we've got actually a little bit of data. There's actually, well, not a little bit. There's quite a bit of data, quite a few papers on. Yeah. Basically, what you're talking about is, would you notice that you're doing better over and over and over? And so, I'll give you my example of my own personal experience. Is that, yeah, I measure myself with a brain gauge frequently, and the other day I measured myself, and I said, no, I'm about the same as the week before. Mm-hmm. And that week was about the same as the week before. And that week was about the same as the week before. But there's very few people out there that actually have access to 5 or 7 year old data. I go back 5 years, and I'm 15, 20% worse. So, there is a little bit of drift.
And I am like a fine wine. I just keep getting better and better until I turn into vinegar. Right. But
then I thought, well, what's happened over the last 5 years is my lifestyle sort of changed in that, well, I got busy. And
he spends a lot more time talking to me.
Yeah,
that's the damage.
Yeah. But basically, we actually talked about this on the show, and we've got a few blogs on it. And the blogs are about things like exercise and being non-sedentary helps your scores. And actually, I thought, well, and we even talked about how reaction time has gotten slower over the last 150 years in the literature. So maybe.
How would you know it?
How would you know it? Other than measuring it, maybe I've gotten a bit more sedentary in the last few years.
Well, speaking about stuff that's happened over the last 100 years, do you feel global warming? I'd like to think I do, but I don't know if it's getting warmer or colder or just nastier, right?
No, but you got to look at
there is
data.
A way to know. You can look
at data
measurements, right? If you're on a diet, it's cool to feel better. I think that's probably most important. But if you want to know if you're losing weight, what do you got to do?
You got to get on a scale.
If you have high blood pressure, how do you know you have high blood pressure? Because you measured it. You can't feel it. It's a silent killer, right? And if you take drugs to deal with high blood pressure, how do you know they're working? You measure it, right? So what we're saying is the brain gauge is a vital measure. That's what I think of it as. I don't know if Mark goes that far, but I think it's a vital measure, or will become the vital measure of brain health. And in order to see whether or not your brain is healthy, how you feel about it is certainly important, but that doesn't tell you conclusively, because things can alter your perceptions, right? I mean, you could be developing dementia right? Over time.
Absolutely.
You know, other things may make your sense of well-being change. You could be doing something that alters, you know, your perception of your mental function. That may make you think your mental function is improving when in fact it's not improving. And we're going to have a whole video on that here in a couple minutes because we're all ready to do that. But the bottom line here today is, do I need the brain gauge? Only if you want to measure your brain function. If you want to do something else, like light a candle, then you need a lighter, right? If you want to measure the pressure in your car tires, then you need a pressure gauge. But if you want to measure how your brain is functioning, I don't know of anything else a person can buy other than a brain gauge. Right?
I don't either. You could spend a lot more money for something that doesn't work. But
well, you could spend a lot of money on stuff that images the brain, but as we sort of made fun of in a few videos earlier, images of the brain don't tell you whether or not the brain is functioning well. They can tell you whether you got a lesion or some kind of gross malformation, but they don't tell you about the subtle nuances of how different foods and different activities and fatigue change your brain function. So in the next video, if you're still awake, if you're not awake, wake up, come on. if you're not awake, if you are awake, the next video we'll talk about this in more detail. So do we have anything else to say?
Yeah, don't swallow your brain gauge.
And for the love of God, kids, don't swallow your brain gauge. It's a dangerous, dangerous scientific instrument, okay? Use only under strict parental guidance.
Yeah.
Thanks.